Hi.
Hello. My name is David. David Kligman. I just wanted to note, you. I mean, I might be wrong about this, but you seem to be proceeding under the impression that what you were saying mostly applied to, what was the phrase you used?
Distributed objects.
Distributed objects, and I actually, like, the more you said, the more I couldn't agree with that. The more I thought that most of what you were saying applied to almost every genre I could think of, just in terms of objects and their relationships with each other. Like,
Right.
I can think, most competitive shooters in some form. What you said about, game systems that stabilize themselves, I think that's an incredibly strong idea, and a lot of well-designed systems can regulate themselves, but then in the name of progress and innovation, people try to introduce things into the systems that weren't intended to be in them from the outset, and it unbalances everything. The best example I can think of is the RTS genre that I've been playing for a long time. What you have is you set up a system of balance with units against other units, and then you make an expansion pack, and in the expansion pack you introduce a new something that on paper isn't any stronger, but it has different capabilities, and at the end of the day that translates out to stronger, and it happens in so many IPs and so many systems, and no one ever catches it. It's the exact same flaw over and over again.
Yeah, I guess I shouldn't have said it applies only to them, but the question I asked in the beginning, why do you care? So that's sort of, you really care in these distributed object games because they're designed to last for a long time, whereas 90% of games are not. So as the player goes through that process of figuring out, for a single player game, if it's a single player game for whatever, it's supposed to have 50 hours of gameplay, it's totally fine if you have a best thing, and slowly at the 47th hour they figured out what that is. That's a fine gameplay experience, right? Things don't actually have to be balanced in that sense.
I disagree with that completely. Go on.
And similarly for these other games, games that are not going to be played over a long period of time, if your player community hasn't got to that best thing, then it doesn't actually matter. There's no difference between a balanced game and an unbalanced game until they reach that point. So, and then for these games, a lot of this is very difficult to do properly and requires a lot of playtest. So, I don't know, from sort of, this is definitely like a bias from my past experience, but if you're not making money for keeping these players in the game for a long time, you have to question, is it worth 2 years of play testing for a game that's only going to last for a month? Or maybe it lasts forever because people love to play it, but you can't see any of that return on investment past that first month. That's there's a business thing going on.
So save your questions for the very end.
We're going to get to it at the end.
And so I'd like to welcome Chris Trottier, who's worked as a game designer on some fairly successful titles, we can say. She got started in the industry working on children's educational games, but became a key figure in the Sim series and in Spore, and as well as in Farmville, which is also a valuable game. So her background in math and physics, she says, contributes to a design style that blends analytic thinking and with creative intuition.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here. Thank you, Frank, for having me. And I have to say, this is the first game design related event that I've been to where there was almost a line in the ladies' room. So, like he said, I came into game design actually through children's products, and so it was never really my intent to be a game designer. And my third week on the job at Maxis, then they had a big sour meeting and said, oh, by the way, we don't do kids products anymore, and you all will be working on these titles now. So my experience for the bulk of my career really was at a company that was quite unusual, and I'm not sure that I kind of realized that at the time, like how unique the games were. It was kind of a nice little kind of scientific kind of sandboxy environment where people were pursuing kind of their interests, and obviously led by Will Wright in particular. but it was a very kind of specific design problem. And so anyone there kind of necessarily ended up designing very specific skills. And the deal was basically anytime you just kind of let the player take charge of the narrative and let the player kind of drive the experience, then it becomes the game designer's job to deliver challenge and interest and motivation given a very kind of unknown set of inputs, right? So in some ways kind of not totally dissimilar from Skaff's problem. And in order to design that kind of game, you can't really just kind of like design all the flow charts and the tables and say, okay, there's my game design. You know, like it's unknown what will happen, and so you kind of have to be very nimble and kind of dynamic about the systems that you put in place. So I had some frustrations on the Spore title and left during that, and didn't really want to take another job, so I started contracting. And immediately met up with a publisher who made casual downloadable games. And it was kind of perfect because they were like, oh, the new big thing in casual downloadable games are light sims. And could you design a light sim for us? And I said, tell me more about what that means. And, you know, as he described it, it was something that we would have prototyped in a week or a month. And so I was like, wow, this is like going to be the easiest, kind of coolest, most fun job ever. And so I threw out some pitches to them, and they picked the first one and said, oh, we love it, let's go, let's go, let's go. And I worked through the design and presented it to this client, and they kind of sat there awkwardly and then kind of were like, well, but where are the levels? And what's the story? And kind of where are the flow charts of how the logic behaves, and where are the data tables? And it was at that point that I think it kind of hit me like, ooh, right, so this isn't how the whole world thinks about game design. And so, you know, over the last number of years, I've had a chance to kind of develop a different set of skills and get exposed to designers who think in a different kind of way. But it's really occurred to me many times in doing that how much, it's almost like if someone works in a type of game design that's kind of more linear, and there's kind of a trajectory that you have players moving along, but then you just kind of give them some degrees of freedom in that. Sometimes designers don't have to design their own algorithms, and so sometimes they don't. And that's fine, but I see so many cases where adding a little bit of fluidity or taking a static system and making it just a little more dynamic would really go a long way. So this thing today is really meant more for people who aren't doing that in their day-to-day design lives right now, who might be up for just a little bit of a challenge. Okay, so this is just going to be like total training wheels. Anyone who's already doing that every day, this is going to be totally elementary for you, but this is for someone not using a lot of algorithms who is up for kind of stretching their muscles a little bit. And just a little soapbox moment. For those of you designing games that are on computers, like, this is one of my kind of like saddest things about the game design industry is how many people seem to have kind of movie envy, like, oh my god, and then one day we're gonna have these spectacular, you know, stories. And our medium is really magic and really unique, and it is one of the only mediums that can kind of like be very responsive to the player in a way that the other mediums just really can't. We'll never be a book, and oh my god, thank god we'll never be a book, right? Okay, so the one thing we all came out of high school math with, right? Like I think the piece of math that everyone remembers is the linear equation, right? Which, if your high school math teacher had been annotating for game designers, would have told you this is the least useful equation that right? So you see game designers kind of trying to take it and change the start point and change the slope, and invariably it kind of doesn't work. But it has I'll get to this. I got called, I was working on a project that I was really enjoying, and someone came to me and said, oh my god, can you help on this other project instead? We're having an emergency. We have no designers, and oh my god, you know, like, we need one today. And so I said, okay, great, what's the problem? How can I help? And they said, we only have 35 levels, and players are at level 35. So, oh my god, what are we gonna do? And I said, what do you mean you only have 35 levels? Like, there's no rewards or whatever to give someone beyond that, or there's no, like people aren't properly motivated to move beyond that. And they said, no, we have plenty of things to motivate players. We only have 35 levels. And so I went and I looked at the table that the designer who had left had created, and it was very reasonable. He knew that their production levels and their ability to generate resource would be increasing over the course of the game, and so the space between the levels was getting bigger as they got to higher levels. So this was all very reasonable, except for two kind of interesting things. One was that any time the designer had kind of done one of the jumps, one of the level ups, the players' ability to generate resource was increasing more gradually than that. So anytime there was a jump like this, players were dropping off. So this was at a company where we could see where player drop-off was happening, and it was highest at those levels. And then they, got to level 34 and game's over. So, okay, so this is the equation that had your math teacher been more helpful would have said, this is like about as close to a Swiss Army knife, I think, as we get in game design. This would be if I could only have one equation for the rest of my life, this would be it. So it's with an exponent, a simple exponent, you can do the exponential growth and you can do the diminishing returns. And so we'll get to the diminishing returns in a second. But, so this was the answer to that problem, games problems, and I wrote the equation in 5 minutes, and I said, okay, great, am I done? Can I go now? And they said no. This is how you take that frustrating kind of linear graph and bend the line, right? Because the linear equation will always either feel too slow at the beginning, like, God, I feel like I want the game to be more responsive to this investment I just made, and this is so frustrating. So anytime you kind of need that line to be a little more nimble, then just this is where to go. And then this is by far, and helpful math teacher again, exponential values over 2 are almost never useful. But if you have something between 1 and 2, that's often kind of what you're looking for with exponential growth. And then for diminishing returns, it's just an exponent between 0 and 1. That's it. That's the whole deal. I'll throw out some examples. On Spore, again, kind of unknown inputs, and had to sort of generate interest. I can't say that this is what the game launched with, but I will tell you what we did during prototyping. And that is, you have player invests in feet, which cost game resource, right? And so they want to get faster and better, obviously, and so there's clear value to that. But you don't want the value to be, to the point where someone with 10 feet is 10 times as fast as someone with 1 foot, or the game breaks, right? So that's where you use the diminishing return. And then we just balanced it out with, the more feet you had, the slower your turn speed got, So there was an upside and there was a downside. Another example, so in The Sims then, the Sims AI is actually the kind of intersection of 2 AIs working together. One is the little simulated beings' desire to fulfill their needs, and the other is the objects in the house saying, this is what I can provide to you, this is what I do. And so we sort of have this problem where you want every object to be somewhat valuable for something. So maybe if someone's really hard up, then they'll like turn on a light for fun or something. And that the bathtub can make them clean, right? But what happened is it just didn't make any sense for someone to be walking across a house, up a flight of stairs, down the hall to turn on a light, right? Like, if you're bored stiff and it's the only thing around, and you just have to get a quick shot of fun, right? But on the other side, you don't want them to say, well, I'm filthy, but I'm sure I have no idea where I would find a bathtub, right? Oh well, I guess I'll just have to go dirty. So what we did is we set the initial values, certainly, of how much value those objects said that they could provide, and then we just had vastly different fall-off rates for different objects. Something that would want a sim to travel pretty far to use it would have a low fall-off rate, and something that didn't make a lot of sense to travel for would have a quick one. So diminishing returns again on that exponent between 0 and 1. Okay, one more example of diminishing returns. Group size, so you could be a more social species in The Sims or in Spore, or you could be kind of a loner species, and there's clear value kind of built into the game of having multiple guys who can hunt better and be more defended and whatever. But then it makes you less stealthy. So it's harder to sneak around and you'll get attacked more often and stuff like that. So there, I included the actual equations in case anyone's interested, but they're all just kind of examples of, and you could probably think of one that you might use even on, in kind of your day-to-day life right now. And that's what I would, if anyone's kind of looking for a challenge, I would call Exponents kind of the gateway drug to algorithms, right? So just, if you're just looking for something that you might be doing through a table now, and you might, like the designer in the leveling curve that I showed you, be kind of creating your own curves already, but manually, just try it and just kind of muck around and see if you can't find the equation that would match also the results that you're looking to do, just as somewhere to get started and kind of flex your muscles maybe. Yeah. So I'm going to kind of now just throw out a few quick examples of, if you get the taste for, hey, I could totally do this with an algorithm, then you could really go places. And so here are a couple of examples of projects I've been on where I've seen that work. So in The Sims, when you go to someone and you try to kiss them, and it's this big dramatic moment, and is it going to work or is it not going to work? There are lots of inputs to the outcome, right? Tons. And what happened is when Will Wright came up with the algorithm himself, it was basically like a really long one sentence of code that combined all of these elements together. So it was kind of like, if they're in a good mood, then they'll be more likely not to care that you're, stinky or whatever. On expansion packs, I saw teams say, yeah, I don't know, I don't understand that, whatever, I'm gonna do the flow chart, right? And it still kind of worked, but it just felt, in my opinion, a little more nuanced and a little more interesting when someone was willing to kind of write the ugly piece of code that made them all work together. Okay, and one other example, so again, this is kind of like a sim. How do they decide what kind of mood they're in? How do they decide what matters to them to do next? This is again when we were writing the AI. You could do that. You could say, well, their mood is just kind of, they care about everything sort of equally, and they'll just pick the thing that's the lowest, or their mood is kind of the average or some kind of weighted average of all of those things. And we tried that, and it just didn't feel right? So. Who's thrilled because they don't have to pee? Like who's just like jumping out of their skin with enthusiasm, right? Or who's going to be starving to death and be like, oh, whatever, I don't care because I just watch TV, So it just didn't work, and it felt uncomfortable, and I guess we could have lived with it. But instead, and again, kind of using Will as an example here of someone who was willing to go in and touch his gears and get really comfortable with the math and exactly how the game mechanics worked. He just drew some graphs of, here's how much I care about, let me kind of trace along here. So hunger when it's low matters a lot. It makes them very unhappy, and it's something that they'll prioritize doing something about. When hunger is higher, it's kind of less of an issue. So it becomes, when everything's taken care of, then it's more like they're caring about things like socializing and having fun and that kind of stuff. So if this makes any sense. So again, just kind of like dabbling maybe in a little bit, kind of like the algorithms and how can you use them yourself to find the kind of one or two pieces in your game that could get a little bit more dynamic. Maybe we all can think of 2 or 3 things that we could do this month in small ways or big ways. I sort of challenged myself to do the same thing and come up with some where there are things where I'm working right now that are implemented in a very static way that could probably be a little more interesting. Were they more dynamic? So for me, it would be things like quests that right now are defined and driven in a very linear way. I can imagine also introducing, like, understanding more about who that player is and how they're playing and the kinds of things that's motivating them, and getting that also into their queue. But again, we all have our own challenges, and maybe if we could come up with the 2 or 3 that would make a difference in our game, then that would be good. There are those who believe that you have to do your own code in order to have this kind of impact on your game, and I don't believe that's true. I'm a horrible coder. And I do the long, like I'll write something and try my best, and someone will say that should be 100 lines of code. Like, what have you done here? The travesty of code. And I'm very inefficient at it, right? So, but I know how to describe or have the conversation with the engineer about what it is that I'm trying to achieve. And so just like, very few people would just go totally hands off on the art and say, oh, well, that's kind of the artist's domain, right? Like, we want our artists to be awesome and talented and amazing designers and artists, right? And it's great when that happens. And it doesn't always happen, right? Like, as the designer of the game experience, you want to know how your gears are working. If you hand it off to someone and say, I don't know, just do the AI, do something smart, you'll sometimes get the amazing results, and oh my God, thank God for those times. And you'll sometimes get a lot of work that's completely invisible to the player. And as a game designer, you're the one who is responsible for kind of knowing the difference and making sure that the right investments are being made, I think. So that's the final point. And I'm gonna go ahead and add Rainer to this list. So some of our heroes are the guys who like really got in and got down and dirty with their gears. And so let's do the next genre, let's do the next big thing, and let's hop in. That's it.
So we'll start with two questions to Chris before we move on to the entire panel.
No, this is an easy one. The graph you showed of all the different values and relative values of like hunger versus was that all coded, or was that all sort of arbitrarily, like, this is what I think the graph looks like, or was that all being generated by formulas?
I think that he actually defined the points on the line.
Okay,
right?
so it was basically done by hand.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
That's true. Good point.
Next question. Alright, so I guess we can move people. Okay, so actually I have a question. So
Right.
So one of the things with this, like, this kind of nice exponential curves, I mean, I've also seen like arguments against them. For example, Noah Feldstein has this argument that like the difficulty curve shouldn't just be this like pure thing. It should actually also like have some sort of roughness to it and unpredictability to it. So could there be something be said for that too?
Well, if it's a thing where it's kind of like you're looking to set up kind of a rhythm, it depends what your goals are. Like, if your goal of having levels is to have someone get whatever that thing is that comes periodically, and you have some notion of what you want periodically to look like, if that has any regularity to it, then you're probably looking for more predictability.
But I think the sort of argument is that typically you want the player to have acquired new skills, and then perhaps once they like learn, especially like a specific new skill, then they'll be facing another challenge which is not equally hard. So they like have a sort of short period of time when they could bask in that like glory and in the new skill before you ramp it up. I think that's Noah Feldstein's argument.
Oh, I know. That's interesting.
All right, so let's move on to sort of general questions to the panel, and the panelists so you can ask a question to a specific panelist or to the entire panelist and entire panel, and other panelists can chime in if they want. So, and remember to introduce yourself.
I'm Naomi Clark. I have a question for Skaff that is about the idea of these skeleton objects that you described, like the 1-1-for-1
Right.
Merfolk object. You described those that you would would try to design them as being an example of a object that was as good as it could be in.
For just a purely vanilla creature in Magic, but
So does that? So here's what I'm curious about. Does that mean it has no sort of like exceptional effects, special abilities and things like
Right.
that, or like how would you go about doing?
I think that's generally the idea. It's not that they have to have no special effects, but maybe it's hard if people aren't familiar with Magic. But the idea certainly was to create that vanilla creature curve, and then a vanilla direct damage curve, and then how much should you pay to draw cards, how much should you pay to force the opponent to discard cards, like these as pure as you can get. Now they will end up interacting with each other, especially like card and mana production, which are the hardest things to balance in the whole game. But yeah, as pure as you can possibly get it, so that once you develop that, you actually kind of understand what's going on. It's as pure a signal as you can get.
And there's still a power curve with those, so there are more expensive ones in terms of mana cost and cheaper
Right.
ones in terms of mana cost. But the Merfolk being like really cheap example.
Right. Really, what it is that it wasn't just the 1/1 for 1, but it was all the points on the vanilla curve were mapped out.
Thanks.
So, please state your name.
Eric Zimmerman. First of all, this was a really, really interesting trio of presentations, and it's really great to get insight into your process. I think what's interesting about all of the presentations relative to Dr. Knizia's presentation earlier is that all of you are, in a sense, are talking about how designing for games that change over time, right, in different ways. Whether it's through a social community and on a social network, whether it's through an economy where the people explore the space of rock, paper, scissors, and kind of new strategies emerge as new possibilities are explored or new cards are released, or whether it's creating this possibility for dynamic change over time. So it's interesting to think about. That seems like it's sort of a new thing, right? That's kind of a more recent innovation in games as opposed to the kind of classic idea of a board game like Who What's It, which is sort of a closed system that players play occasionally, but there's not a sense of engagement with it through a culture of practice. For example, the hidden Black Knight movement that Reiner talked about is exactly the kind of dynamic, not exactly, but it's the kind of beneath the surface subtlety that all three of you are talking about, that in some weird sense digital players discover on their own. So this is more of a comment. I hope you can find a question, and I have another actual question.
We have to come up with our own questions.
But I'm curious. I want to ask you guys to. I don't know. To me, it's interesting, and I'd love to hear you talk about each other's presentations relative to this idea of player dynamic changing over time. But the other thing I wanted to ask all three of you is just the role of theory, design theory, and what is design theory relative to your practice. So all of you sort of presented kind of nuts and bolts procedures for how you approach certain problems. There's this whole sort of other interesting body of work having to do with game design theory. I mean, I've done some of it, Jesper's done some of it, and some people are more researchers and some are more working designers. And I'm curious, if there's Daniel Cook's game design molecules, or Doug Church's formal abstract design tools, Marc LeBlanc's mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics. So there's lots of models, not just theories about games like cultural anthropology, but specifically game design theory, game design patterns. There's many people that have done it. I'm curious if it's useful or interesting to any of your processes.
There's a question.
So
We did the nuts and bolts stuff because that's what you asked us to do. That's how we got there. Does that answer your question?
Do any of you guys use those things? So Eric just rattled off a bunch of them. Does anyone in the room use those?
What?
Raise your hands if you apply any of the things like the formal abstract design tools, or MDA, or Dan Cook. Okay, so some of us do. Do any of you guys?
No.
Because I love them. They're awesome. I love reading about them and thinking about them. But in my day-to-day work, it's true that I almost never really find myself consciously applying them. Some of us do.
So I'll say, for Chris's talk, just getting in your head, right? Oh, these are all the curves that you can use. Like that's really important. That's I think that kind of thing is maybe undervalued. It's not that one thing in particular is your solution, but you want to, I guess, read those things. Maybe something will be helpful in them, or think about rock, paper, scissors, or think about whatever, an exponent between 0 and 1 or whatever to solve your problem. It's just like you build up all these tools. They don't actually help you in terms of process. It's like, you know, at the end of the day, they're just things that should be floating around in your head
Yeah.
to increase your tool.
Yeah, it's funny, like day to day, I find that like the things I've been working on most over like the past year or so are things like, how do I keep myself fresh when I fall out of my groove, you know, and like how do I get back in it? And it's like very practical, like personal, kind of like, okay, I'm losing focus, how do I, you know, and so it's almost like that's kind of where I'm focusing my growth right now, is like
How do you do
staying
that?
on, like maximizing the use of my time.
How do you do that?
Like for me, I change location.
Okay. Cool.
I have sort of a question about dubers and dragons, like this whole sort of random, like kind of the Kahneman and Tversky, like the irrational human side. Like you guys were all talking about, all right, I'm trying to create this predictable system while I'm dealing with the SERP and the conditions, and I'm really interested in the strange conditions of human beings and their propensity to make stories out of the weirdest things. And I love that idea that people like to play dragons, so something that beats dragons is oddly powerful and useful. So I mean, I'm just interested in the panel in general. How do you handle those sorts of things and how those things come to play in your process? I'm sure that came up a lot with The Sims, for example.
I actually haven't made a game with dubers in it yet, which I'm quite proud of. But I personally feel like those kinds of sort of emergent magical moments in games, my preference is almost to let them happen on their own. Like to as Frank once said, you know, to leave space for the magical. Did I quote you right?
Something like
Did I just misquote you? Okay. Rather than actually just sort of explicitly designing those moments. I've also explicitly designed them. I mean, there's moments in Gardens of Time that very, 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 very few people see. But the few people that do see them, they're incredibly special.
Yeah.
But,
I find that leaving, like, obviously a lot of room for players to set their own paths, but then combined with kind of things that are going to surprise them. You know, I always say the like cheapest line of code per mileage that we got out of it in The Sims was jealousy. So it was as simple as if someone kissed another person in the same room and anyone else was in love with them, it was a one line of code where the other person would come over and like smack them down and start yelling at them, and it was just a tiny little piece of something that just really all of a sudden kind of increased someone's thoughts about what was possible in the game. So yeah, breadth and freedom plus, you know, delight.
I do get a sense that The Sims is an untapped treasure trove of dynamics and algorithms, and like I should probably just spend a lot more time studying all of the interplays of these different values.
It was the redheaded stepchild project at Maxis for a long time.
Hi, I'm Rob Devin. One thing I noticed in all three of your talks is how important feedback seems to be to all of you in the design process. Getting feedback from the systems that you've designed. And Skaff, your thing about the rodeo really stuck with me, about seeking that out. But I wonder, because in a rodeo, you have the feedback mechanism of a horse that you're sitting on, and it's bucking and you're reacting to it. And so when you're talking about something like a card game, where you're sending this out through like a one-way retail channel, what is your horse? Like, how do you develop, and this applies to, I think, I'd love to hear all three of your thoughts on it. Like, how do you develop that feedback mechanism for yourself?
So the analogy of the rodeo versus dressage was it works in two ways. One is for the designer as the rider, right? You don't want to in dressage you want to appear in control. It's very important. In a rodeo, actually, it's the opposite. if you could just totally manhandle your horse, and this is actually, I don't know if anyone follows rodeo, but it does happen sometimes. Like you get these big strong cowboys, and their horse isn't going to buck them off, but they don't win. But you don't want the appearance of control. You want to be in control because you want to last the whole time. But you don't want the appearance of control because you'll be actually rated lower by the judges. So that's sort of the analogy there. Like, so you want to release this game that ultimately you're kind of in control of, but there's these massive variations that you really aren't. You really aren't in control of. You don't know what the horse is going to do. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, and so the crowd and the people can tell that, right? I mean, I think, yeah. So spur the horse by releasing expansions or whatever. But the crowd really can tell whether you're totally in control or not. And then the second thing is also similarly the experience for the player. Some people really like feeling in control when they play games, and they're going to play the equivalent of a dressage game where they're in control of every minute detail. But I think the players that like a lot of these games, actually the panel's talking about, they don't know where it's going to go. So you also give them that same feeling that you have as a designer. Their play experience is similar to that. Like they don't know what's going to happen in the Sims tomorrow, or they don't know what kind of decks they're going to see when they go to a tournament.
The most exciting moments for me are when you can do something that kind of has a player finding their own creative process a little bit. I'm not sure if this addresses what you were saying, but almost all players that you talk to would be like, oh, I'm not creative, I totally, can't design this, that, and the other thing. But if you put just enough things in there that get them to engage with your toy set in such a way where their creative spark takes hold and all of a sudden it becomes about them and not about you, then their investment just grows exponentially, right?
I guess other than watching over their shoulder, how do you observe that? Like, how are you aware of? I mean, or do you just look over people's shoulders?
So on The Sims, we literally, we did rapid fire focus groups, where rather than doing a giant, hugely produced focus group where we came away with 100 items, we'd do a focus group every 3 days and pick our top 3. And the best focus group team we ever had was like 2 college roommates who were fighting for the mouse and like, no, I want to put in the, and so like anything that kind of gets them talking, and really talking about how they're feeling, like we were not above any cheap tricks. It was not very like professionally done focus groups, but it was amazing.
There's an entire range of different types of feedback that you can get from people depending on the context of the situation. I think user testing is incredibly important. You get one very, very specific type of feedback from that. 2, if you're looking for both sort of game design and user experience feedback, which I always am. But then there's also just watching someone play something when they don't think they're being watched. I make no bones about just walking behind people in the office and seeing what they're playing and seeing how they're playing it, even if it has nothing to do with what I'm working on right now. I really love seeing moments where someone's doing something incorrectly and they don't know why they're doing something incorrectly, because I think those are just fantastic and awesome. And even feedback from just describing something to somebody, giving them a rough piece of an idea and seeing if it actually makes them light up in a way, or best yet, giving them a rough piece of an idea and seeing what their interpretation of that is. One of the most interesting things to me in design is giving 3 different people the same sort of seed of an idea and seeing what completely different directions they take it in. Or you tell them something and then you show them it later and they're like, oh, that's completely different than what I thought it is. The first thing I want to know is, what did you think it was going to be? Like, that's always really exciting.
Cool, thanks.
Yes, I guess we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Yeah. So, all right, I think you were first.
I'm Dylan Rogers. I'm a NYU freshman. And this question's directed at Skaff, but Chris and Scott, feel free to jump in. I noticed your sort of negative annotation about post-release balancing, and I had a thought that you see a lot of games that are pretty big nowadays, like World of Warcraft, Team Fortress 2, StarCraft, where a lot of time and resources has been directed at post-release balancing.
But right, I should have put some qualifier on that. What well, sorry, was there more to your?
No, I just
Okay.
wanted to see.
Yeah,
your thoughts on
it's in StarCraft, right? I've already paid my money. It's not like I bought the Zerglings and now you've made them worse, and so I'm really pissed off because I bought them on the secondary market for hundreds of dollars or whatever. So so in those types of games, when I said it was a disaster, it's not a disaster for those sorts of things. You will tend to turn off a certain part of your player base, but it's no disaster. So, but if they've paid for stuff, yeah, it's pretty bad. Like a Diablo, even Diablo, people paid so much for objects on the secondary market there that, and you notice they didn't, at least to the best of my knowledge, they didn't do any really serious post-launch balancing there. Like they're pretty smart. They're at Blizzard, as you may have realized. So they didn't screw with that kind of stuff.
There's tons of it. There's like 13 patches to Diablo.
Yeah, but it does not like we lowering the power of this item or whatever, right? The things that they tended to change, they fixed a lot of bugs, and they did. It is true, like right in the beginning, they did hose a couple character classes. So secondarily, that'll have this ripple effect of it will hose the items, but mostly what they changed was skills, not individual items.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. And one extra thing is, they weren't making money at the time for Diablo 2 off that market. So I think they didn't want to piss off players, but again, it wasn't really nearly as bad as it will be for them with Diablo 3 when they do it.
Hey, Scott, I just was curious whether you had any ideas for, in your prototyping of social games, for the rhythm of outcomes. You said at the end of the week, you counted up points and determined a winner, and that's such a powerful moment in physical games and games where people are present, and that moment is almost never there in these kind of persistent, pervasive games. So did you think about that and how to capture that in prototypes at all?
Yeah, specifically for that prototype, we weren't keeping people up to date on what the leaderboard was. And I think the reason for that is we were trying to focus on the lightest possible touch for the game. I didn't want it to be ever present throughout the day. I wanted people to be productive. But it would, had we continued to prototype it, had we continued to spend time on it, it would have been interesting to constantly surface the leaderboard. So similar to games like Bejeweled Blitz, like any game that's followed the weekly leaderboard trope, to sort of have that be a constant presence, because it's incredibly valuable for re-engaging those players. To just sort of constantly be able to see that update, because that's part of that loop as well. It's, okay, I didn't play for a couple days, but how did my movement in the leaderboard change?
So,
Hi, so Jackie. I had a question specifically about, you were just talking about prototyping for the social games. Have you found, or do you think there's a way to prototype on a compressed scale, like instead of the social game we played over a long period of time, have you found ways to prototype that so you can see how it'll play or do your design work on a compressed scale, so like over the course of a day or whatever it is, you could play a little prototype version of the game and kind of get your information?
Yeah, definitely, because time doesn't always allow for that kind of long breath. So, done prototypes in the past where, it's a game that has a lot of timers in it, and so all the timers get sped up. So something gestates for 30 seconds instead of 5 minutes, and we just sort of, divide down to kind of get that sort of rapid play experience. But then you'll get certain valuable learnings from that. You'll get a sort of sense of what the arc will feel like and whether or not that feels valuable, but you won't get a sense of, does that gestation time feel legitimate, and are those styles of gestation sustainable for a longer period of time? So it's incredibly valuable to do that kind of testing, and it's valuable to have debugging stuff that lets you sort of skip time. But the hard thing about it, and the thing that I think we just keep not accounting for, is the fact that the time itself is as valuable to those prototypes as the mechanics at play.
I would say that the majority of prototypes I've done are like 5 minutes with the stapler and the pencils and the Post-its. Like, are we heading down the right path, or is this a dead end? Like, just kind of a quick reality check. Like, where are we going? Okay, we're good. But prototype, not like putting code to.
I'd kill to see more prototypes. I think I was really, really excited to be able to show an actual prototype because so much of them are so closely related. I think Spore is a weird exception where Haim and Chris Hecker were all too willing to get up on stage and show all the various prototypes throughout the development process because it was basically an open book. But there's so much amazing learnings that come out of the prototyping process that we just never ever see. And it's actually really hard for me to have a sense of what prototypes look like other than the few places that I've worked in the industry. So I'd kill for someone to do a gameprototypes.tumblr.com or something.
That's really interesting.
All right, so very last question, gentleman in the middle.
Hi guys, Wade Tinney. I'm curious how much you guys either allow yourselves or require yourselves to kind of design into the future. I mean, considering that you're all designing for rolling games that are changing all the time, we're constantly going to have new information coming in. How far ahead of that curve do you design?
Far. If I didn't, I'd lose my job. It's really, for social games specifically, if you're not thinking of future content, if you're not future-proofing the design, then you're just spending time on something that won't ever be an ROI. You'll never make back what you put into it. So it's incredibly important from the earliest stages to be thinking, how is this extensible? How is this scalable? And what's our content plan for a while?
Okay, so
I was going to say, well, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm curious to know more, is it
specifically
3 months or 6 months?
Anything less than a month, I think, is a fail. Because you just need to have a content plan, you need to have a feature plan, you need to also assume that your ability to put that stuff out is going to be crippled for the first month following launch because you're going to be chasing bugs and chasing crises left and right.
Right.
So
and
anything.
Then I guess the secondary part of that question is how, typically, generally speaking, what's the delta between what you've designed ahead for and then how much it changes due to new information back from the players or from metrics?
Varies. Sometimes it's massive and terrifying, and rarely you've done an amazing job predicting everything and you stay on track, but it definitely varies.
I was going to say, I do a lot of stuff that's not these ongoing things as well. And talking about return on investment, you really have to, unfortunately, decide up front, how long is this game, or what do you think, how long is this game going to go on for? Because if the answer is at least 6 months or 9 months or a year, yeah, you need to plan it all out front. But at the same time, if it's not going to be if it's going to be a one-shot, you do not want to waste your time on building everything into it. You can't afford to do that. You got to move on to the next game.
But you make an interesting point. Part of that content, looking out ahead of that kind of content and features is needing to also plan in flexibility for when things do change and when your expectations do shift. So, if you have this amazing, great content feature rollout plan and then it's completely invalidated by the play patterns and the experiences of the players, which do not at all meet your expectations but are still totally valid, adhering to your previous plan is not prudent. So,
For me, the answer would be it's been hugely variable depending on the company and kind of the size of the problem and the size of the opportunity. When it's a really risky question and you really don't want to, you want to minimize your risks as much as you can, then you have more opportunity for kind of checkpoints. And when it's a pretty known problem, then, and different companies have different abilities to scale team size. Sometimes you can have a small team for a while, and it's not like you'll have a team of artists sitting around twiddling their thumbs, which inherently kind of wants to drive you toward putting things down.
Yeah, it's definitely a resource issue too.
Yeah.
If you're not going to have the resources to aggressively pump content out every week, then you probably want to have a backlog.
All right, and with that, I'd like to thank the distinguished panel.